I discovered all of my wife's infidelity when I saw something terrible on her neck. It wasn't what I expected. It wasn't a lipstick mark, a strange strand of hair, or a piece of jewelry I'd never seen before. It was something much more subtle, much more intimate, and at the same time devastating. I hugged her as always, trying to ignore that nagging feeling that had been bothering me for weeks. She seemed distant, cold. But the worst was yet to come. When my hand brushed the skin of his neck, something hit me like a punch to the stomach. A familiar aroma, but one that did not belong to us, to our world. A masculine, woodsy scent, strong enough to make me recoil, but subtle enough to make me question my sanity. She didn't notice my reaction. She continued talking about trivialities, as if everything was perfectly normal. But in that moment, I knew. Something was terribly wrong. I spent sleepless nights, reliving that moment, trying to convince myself that it was just a coincidence, a mixture of odors in the air, perhaps. But every time we met, that scent was there, lingering, impregnated in her, like an invisible scar. And with it came doubts, suspicions, and finally certainty. Something was happening, something I could no longer ignore. I needed proof, but at the same time I feared what I might find. Every detail, every gesture of hers seemed poisoned by that perfume. The lies began to intertwine with the truths, and I found myself trapped in a web that I had constructed over the years. What was once trust has crumbled to ashes, leaving only the embers of burning jealousy and deadly distrust. But what really broke me was not the discovery itself, but the way she looked at me when I finally confronted her. An empty look, without remorse, without guilt. Just cold indifference. And in that moment, I realized that the scent was just the beginning of a much darker truth, something that was buried deep inside where I never imagined looking. Now I'm here, alone, reliving every detail, every clue I ignored. The nights out, the vague excuses, the forced smiles. It was all there, right before my eyes, and I was blind. But not anymore. Now, I'm determined to find out how far this betrayal goes. And when I find out, when I finally understand what happened, nothing will be the same again. But the truth, this truth I'm about to uncover, may be more painful than I ever imagined. And that, I will tell you. New York was especially cold that winter. The streets, usually busy, seemed quieter, enveloped in a piercing silence that contrasted with the usual noise of the city. In one of Manhattan's oldest neighborhoods was the apartment of Henry and Laura, a couple who seemed, at first glance, to have everything they could want. Married for just over 5 years, they had built a life that many would envy. He is a successful lawyer, known for his ability to negotiate complex agreements. She is a talented interior designer, whose projects have appeared in renowned magazines. But behind the exposed brick walls of the elegant apartment, there were cracks that few could see. Henry had always been proud of the relationship he had with Laura. They met in an art gallery on a random night that ended up being the beginning of everything. From the beginning, Laura enchanted Henry with her unassuming charm and enigmatic smile. There was something about her that made him feel like the world was more interesting than he had ever imagined. The first few years were one of pure passion, endless nights of deep conversations and plans for a shared future. But as time passed, something began to change. Laura, who had always been independent and self-assured, began to distance herself. At first, Henry thought it was just the stress of work or tiredness from the many trips she made for her projects. He tried to understand, believing that the phase would pass. But Laura's short absences began to become frequent. She stayed late at the office, made up last-minute appointments, and the weekends previously dedicated to the couple were now filled with activities that Henry didn't fully understand. Henry, however, was patient. He had always prided himself on being a rational man, someone who preferred to think before acting. He tried to ignore the growing discomfort, busying himself with his cases, the endless meetings and business dinners. However, the emptiness at home was increasingly evident. Conversations became brief, glances became less frequent, and intimacy, once so natural, now seemed forced, almost mechanical. One night, while waiting for Laura to return from another of her appointments, Henry stood in the living room, looking at the apartment they had decorated together. Memories of happy moments were scattered everywhere. Travel photos, hand-picked paintings, memories of a time when everything seemed perfect. But now, those memories seemed ghostly, shadows of a life he could no longer recognize. When Laura finally arrived late at night, Henry watched her in silence. She looked stunning as always, her blonde hair perfectly done, her makeup subtle but flawless. The smile she gave when she entered seemed rehearsed, an empty gesture that didn't reach her eyes. Henry greeted her with a kiss on the forehead, noticing how the contact felt colder than usual. They exchanged brief words about the day, but Henry noticed something was off, something he still couldn't put his finger on. Laura was a woman who knew how to hide her feelings. She had always been reserved, controlled, and Henry respected that about her. But that night, as she undressed for bed, he noticed a small change. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but something about the way she avoided his eyes, the way she moved quickly, caught his attention. He didn't know what it was, but a part of him, a part he had ignored for so long, began to question. The next morning, as they drank coffee, the silence between them was almost palpable. Laura was distracted, playing on her cell phone with a slight smile on her lips. Henry watched, trying to decipher what she might be thinking. When she finally put away her cell phone and got up to leave, Henry called out to her, trying to sound casual. "You've been working a lot lately. When was the last time we took some time for the two of us?" he asked, hoping for an answer that would ease the growing tension. Laura smiled, but again it was a smile without warmth. "I know, Henry. I'm sorry. It's just that things are a little complicated at work right now. But I promise we'll work it out soon." She came closer and gave him a soft kiss, but Henry felt the same coldness, the same distance. And once again, the subtle perfume, that woody scent that he knew was neither hers nor his. The discomfort returned, but he pushed it to the back of his mind, trying not to let suspicion take over. After all, he trusted Laura. Or at least he tried. The following days were a repetition of this pattern. Laura left early and returned late, and increasingly Henry found himself alone in an apartment that seemed too big for just one person. He started working more, taking on cases he would have previously turned down, just so he wouldn't have to face the void Laura left behind. But over time, this emptiness became unbearable. He could no longer ignore the feeling that something was wrong, that there was something Laura wasn't telling him. Then one night while Laura was out, Henry did something he never thought he would do. He went to her room, the space she used for her projects and work. He opened drawers, rummaged through papers, looking for anything that could explain what was happening. He found nothing that could confirm his suspicions. But the simple fact that he was doing this, of invading her space, made him feel a weight in his stomach, a guilt that he couldn't dispel. When Laura returned, he tried to act normal, but she noticed something was different. "Are you well?" she asked, looking concerned. I just had a rough day at the office," Henry lied, forcing a smile that he knew was unconvincing. But Laura didn't press. She just nodded and continued with her routine as if nothing was wrong. But Henry knew that behind those familiar gestures, there was something more, something he needed to discover. And so, the distance between them grew, fueled by unspoken secrets and prolonged silences. What started as a small doubt turned into a suffocating certainty. But Henry still wasn't ready to face the truth. He still believed he could save what was left of his marriage, that things could go back to the way they were before. But what he didn't know was that sometimes the truth is much more painful than any lie. Meanwhile, New York continued at its frenetic pace, indifferent to the personal dramas of its inhabitants. The city lights shone brightly, as if trying to overshadow the shadows forming inside Henry's heart. But not even the city lights could hide what was to come. The days turned into weeks, and the discomfort Henry felt towards Laura only intensified. He began to pay more attention to details that he previously ignored. Laura's long absences, the phone calls that she answered hastily and always in another room, the increasingly flimsy excuses about unexpected meetings and last-minute commitments. Henry was not naive. He knew something was wrong, but he still clung to the hope that it was all just his imagination. However, the presence of that strange perfume permeated on her skin was something he couldn't get out of his head. It was silent proof that there was a third element in that relationship, something or someone he still couldn't identify. One night, while they were having dinner at a restaurant they used to frequent, Henry noticed that Laura was more distracted than usual. She was fiddling with her cell phone under the table as if waiting for a message. When he asked something trivial about her work, Laura responded vaguely without really paying attention. Henry, already used to the recent distance, just watched. He didn't want to provoke an argument, but the tension between them was palpable. Even the waiter noticed, avoiding prolonging the interaction and serving the dishes in silence. When dinner was over, Laura asked to go alone to a work party she had mentioned. Henry accepted, but the decision weighed heavily on his chest. He wasn't a controlling man, he always trusted her, but now everything seemed like a game of shadows. Upon returning home alone, he found himself in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at his own reflection, trying to recognize the man he saw. It was as if a part of him was disappearing, sucked away by that growing distrust. Henry wasn't sure what motivated him that night, but something inside him snapped. He grabbed his coat, left the apartment and called a taxi. I told the driver the address of the party Laura had mentioned, but I didn't expect to find her there. When he arrived at the place as suspected, she was not there. The event was real, but Laura had not attended. A wave of anger and frustration washed over Henry. He returned home and for the first time he felt the urgent need to confront her, but he held back. Instead he waited. He spent hours awake looking at the clock until finally, around 2 in the morning, Laura entered the house. She seemed surprised to find Henry awake, but quickly covered it with a smile. "You didn't need to wait for me," he said, with a sweetness that only increased Henry's distrust. But he remained silent, watching her as she walked to her room. When Laura lay down next to him, Henry noticed that perfume again. It wasn't hers nor his. It was another, persistent, like a shadow between them. In the days that followed, Henry began discreetly planning. He needed to discover the truth, and to do that he would have to be careful. He decided to follow her on one of her supposed work commitments. He didn't know what he would find, but he was determined to face whatever came. When the day arrived, he watched her leave, dressed as elegantly as ever, but with a sparkle in her eyes that he hadn't seen in a long time. Henry waited a few minutes and then followed their steps, keeping his distance so as not to be noticed. Laura didn't go to the office. Instead, he took a taxi toward the city center, and Henry drove. She got off in front of a luxurious hotel, a place they had never been to. Henry parked across the street and watched as Laura entered the lobby, greeting the receptionist with familiarity. Henry's heart quickened. He wanted to confront her right then and there, but a part of him knew this wasn't the time. He waited, watching her disappear into the elevator. The wait was unbearable, every minute an eternity. Hours later, Laura left the hotel. The smile on his face was different, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. She looked like a different person, more alive, more radiant. Henry felt the impact of this vision like a blow. He knew what was happening in that hotel was not innocent, but the shock of the confirmation left him paralyzed. He followed her until she stopped at a flower shop. Henry saw Laura buy a bouquet of roses, something he hadn't done in years. She got back in the taxi and headed home as if nothing had happened. When Laura came home that night, Henry was sitting on the couch, waiting. He watched as she placed the flowers in a vase and commented on what a wonderful day she had had. But Henry couldn't pretend anymore. The silence between them grew, an invisible barrier that now seemed insurmountable. However, he did not confront her. Not yet. Instead, he watched her more closely, trying to find some clue that he was wrong. But the truth was before him, undeniable, and with it, a deep, growing pain. Over the next few nights, Henry could barely sleep. He heard Laura's every move, every step she took around the house, and his mind kept going over the events of that night at the hotel. The pain of betrayal was turning into something more, something dark. Henry realized that despite the love he felt for Laura, he couldn't ignore what was happening. He needed answers. And most of all, I needed a plan. The idea of revenge began to form, a thought he would have pushed away before, but now seemed inevitable. The relationship between them, which was already fragile, began to deteriorate quickly. Conversations became almost non-existent, and the silence, which was once comfortable, was now unbearable. Henry began to investigate on his own, looking for clues that would confirm his suspicions. He checked the phone bills, the credit cards, even the messages on her cell phone, but Laura was careful. There was no concrete evidence, just that lingering scent, permeated on her like an invisible mark. Henry knew he could no longer delay the confrontation. The moment of truth was approaching, and he would have to be prepared for what came next. Henry was at the edge of his sanity. Every minute that passed without answers, every moment he spent at Laura's side, knowing what he knew, only increased the pressure in his chest. He could no longer continue living in that suffocating uncertainty. The need to discover the truth, to finally face what was happening, became irresistible. Determined, he waited for an opportunity, a moment when Laura could no longer escape his questions, where she would have to face what she was doing to them. This opportunity came one night when Laura once again returned home late. Henry sat in the living room, the lights dimmed, the room enveloped in a stillness that contrasted with the storm within him. He heard her come in, her heels clicking on the wooden floor, the rustle of her purse as she placed it on the sideboard. Laura stopped when she saw him there in the dark, with only the soft light from the street illuminating their faces. She hesitated for a moment, as if she felt something was about to happen. "Henry? Everything is fine?" Laura's voice sounded cautious, almost worried, but there was something more there, something Henry could no longer ignore. He stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on hers. "We need to talk, Laura." The tone in his voice made Laura stiffen. She knew that moment would come, but she wasn't prepared to face it. Still, he tried to maintain his composure. "Sure about what?" Henry didn't look away, standing firm, controlling the anger that was rising inside him. "About us. About what's happening to us." Laura took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. I know things have been difficult lately, but it's just a phase, Henry. We're both busy, it happens. But Henry was no longer willing to accept empty excuses. It's not just that, Laura, and you know it. He took a step forward, approaching her, smelling that perfume that haunted him again. There's something more, something you're not telling me. Laura blinked, trying not to show nervousness. What do you mean by something else? That perfume. The words came out harsher than he intended. That damn perfume you wear. He's not yours, never was. I feel it every time you come home, and every time I feel it, I know there's someone else involved. Someone who shouldn't be. The tension in the air was almost palpable. Laura looked at Henry for a long moment, trying to gauge what he really knew. But upon seeing the resolute look on his face, she realized there was no denying it anymore. She knew she was trapped. Henry, Laura began, but her voice trailed off. She didn't know how to finish that sentence. Who is he, Laura? Henry's voice was low but firm. There was no more patience or understanding there, just the need to know the truth. Who is he? Laura hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. She knew this was the moment of truth, but the words wouldn't come out. She knew that anything she said could destroy everything that was left between them. But I also knew that Henry wouldn't give up. Finally, with a heavy sigh, she looked up to meet his. It's not what you think, Henry. Her voice was soft but filled with guilt. It's not just one person, it's not just one case. Henry blinked, confused. That didn't make sense to him. What do you mean? It's more complicated than that, she murmured, looking away. I met someone, yes, but that wasn't all. I felt trapped, suffocated, and this person made me feel alive again. It was like I was living a life that wasn't mine, and I needed a way out. Henry was silent, trying to process her words. He expected anger, pain, but what he found was something darker, a feeling that there was something much bigger, something he hadn't anticipated. What do you mean that wasn't all? Laura took a deep breath, knowing there was no turning back. I found someone who made me question everything, Henry. Not just our marriage, but who I am, what I want in life. It wasn't just an affair, it was an awakening. And I didn't know how to deal with it. Henry felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He was ready to hear about physical betrayal, about a lover. But this was much deeper, much more destructive. So, you don't love me anymore? The question hung in the air like a knife. Laura closed her eyes for a moment as if wanting to escape that reality, but finally she responded, almost in a whisper. I don't know, Henry. I don't know who I am anymore. Those words broke something inside Henry. The anger he felt was replaced by an overwhelming emptiness. He realized that what was lost was not just the marriage, but the person he believed Laura to be. And now he found himself faced with an impossible choice. Keep living that lie or face the harsh reality that their love might be long dead, buried under the weight of secrets and regrets. And that perfume? Henry asked, his voice hoarse, tired. What does it mean? Laura hesitated before answering. It belongs to the person who showed me this other side of life. It's not that I use it on purpose, but sometimes I let it stay with me as a reminder of what I felt. Henry felt a lump tighten in his throat. All he wanted was to explode, to scream, to demand answers that would ease the pain, but instead he just nodded. And now, what do you want to do, Laura? She looked at him, tears forming in her eyes. I don't know, Henry. I really don't know. The silence between them stretched, heavy and painful. They both knew there was no easy answer, that any decision would be fraught with pain. And deep down, they both knew that that conversation was just the beginning of something that could destroy them forever. In the days that followed, silence reigned between Henry and Laura. Neither of them had the courage to resume the conversation, to dive back into that emotional abyss that now separated them. Henry became more introspective, spending long hours at the office, avoiding returning home until late at night. He tried to focus on work, but his mind couldn't escape the chaos that was his personal life. Every time he looked at the ring on his finger, he felt the weight of broken promises and shattered dreams. Laura, on the other hand, isolated herself even more. She avoided Henry, avoiding any situation that might force a new argument. She spent more time away from home, immersing herself in work or in empty social gatherings that only served to distract her from reality. She knew she was being cowardly, but she simply didn't have the strength to face the consequences of her choices. One night, Henry came home later than usual. The apartment was dark, except for a dim light coming from the bedroom. He dropped the folder on the sofa and walked slowly towards it, his heart heavy. When he opened the door, he found Laura sitting on the bed, holding an almost empty glass of wine. She looked exhausted, with her eyes fixed on a distant point, as if she were lost in her own thoughts. "We need to resolve this, Laura," Henry said finally, his voice breaking the silence. She didn't respond immediately, just took a long sip of wine before turning to him. "I know," he murmured with painful resignation. Henry came over, sitting on the edge of the bed facing her. "This cannot continue like this. We are just existing without actually living." Laura nodded but said nothing. There was so much that needed to be said, but the words just wouldn't come. The truth was that they were both trapped in a cycle of pain and regret, unable to find a way out. "I wonder when it all started to go wrong," Henry continued, more to himself than to her. "When did we lose control of our own lives?" Laura looked at him, her eyes shining with tears she was trying to hold back. "I don't know. Maybe it was gradual, maybe it didn't have a specific moment. But at some point we stopped being who we were, and I don't know if we can go back." "I still love you, Laura," Henry confessed, the pain evident in his voice. "But I don't know if that's enough." The words hung in the air, filled with despair. They knew that love, no matter how strong it was, could not erase everything that happened. There were hurts that could not be healed, wounds that could not be forgotten. "I love you too, Henry," Laura finally replied, her voice a whisper. "But I got lost and I don't know how to get back. And maybe there's no going back." Silence fell between them again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was a silence full of understanding, of a painful acceptance of the reality that they had both avoided for so long. They knew that what they had, what once brought them together, was beyond rescue. And in that moment, they realized that sometimes the hardest thing to do is admit that love isn't enough to fix everything. Henry took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. "Maybe it's time to move on, Laura? To leave the past behind and make space so that we can find happiness, wherever that may be." Laura closed her eyes, allowing the tears to finally fall. She knew he was right. There was nothing more to say, nothing that could save what was already destroyed. And so, sitting there side by side, they accepted the inevitable. The love that once brought them together had transformed into something unrecognizable, and the only thing left was to let it go. As he stood up to leave the room, Henry stopped at the door and looked back one last time. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Laura." "In truth." She nodded, unable to respond, and watched him disappear down the hall. And with that, they both knew that this was the end of a story that was once beautiful, but now needed to be closed. After that night, the atmosphere in the apartment changed drastically. Silence was no longer a consequence of distancing, but a mutual decision. Henry and Laura coexisted in a kind of silent truce, a tacit agreement that the direct confrontation was over but that the outcome was yet to come. Each one dealt with the situation in their own way. Laura took refuge in work and her long walks around the city, while Henry, still attached to the idea of a resolution, immersed himself in reflections that consumed him. Henry was trapped in a dilemma that was eating him up inside. He knew the separation was imminent, but there was something inside him that refused to give up completely. After all, how could I simply leave behind years of shared life, memories that had been so carefully constructed? And yet there was the matter of betrayal, of the breach of trust that seemed impossible to repair. What he feared most was discovering that even if he tried, he would never be able to forgive Laura, that the ghost of betrayal would always haunt him, even if he decided to move on with her. Laura, on the other hand, was also facing her own demons. The truth she had revealed to Henry left her even more divided. She knew she had hurt the man she once loved deeply, but she also couldn't deny that something inside her had changed. The relationship with that other person, which had started as a simple escape, evolved into something deeper, a need to find who she was outside of marriage. But this search, which brought her so much relief, also left her with unbearable guilt. How could she justify her desire to be happy if it meant destroying the life of someone who loved her? The moral dilemma the two faced unfolded slowly, in each unspoken conversation, in each glance exchanged. Laura knew she needed to make a decision, and that continuing to postpone it would only prolong their suffering. She thought about leaving the house, about giving them both space to breathe and reflect on what to do next. But something was stopping her, perhaps the fear of the unknown, or perhaps the guilt she still carried. Henry, on the other hand, began to question his own motivations. Did he really want to save the marriage, or was he just trying to preserve the image of a life that no longer existed? One night, as the two stood on opposite sides of the living room, Henry finally broke the silence. "Laura," he began, his voice low but carrying an obvious weight. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what happened. And honestly, I don't know what's harder, facing the fact that you cheated on me or accepting that I may never be able to fully forgive you." Laura looked up, surprised by Henry's sincere tone. She expected more resentment, more accusations, but instead she found a tired man, worn down by everything they had been through. "I don't know how to move on either, Henry," she replied, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "I feel like I lost my way somewhere along the way, and now I'm stuck between wanting to fix things and knowing that maybe that's not possible." The dilemma the two faced was more than just a question of separation or reconciliation. It was an internal struggle where every decision seemed wrong in some way. They knew that separation would bring pain not just to them but to everyone around them, friends, family, colleagues. But staying together, pretending they could get through everything, also seemed unbearable. The reality was that there was no clear solution, and whatever choice they made would leave deep scars. Henry looked at Laura, trying to see beyond the woman he knew, trying to understand who she was now. "If we decide to go our separate ways," he said, his voice firm, "we need to do it in a way that doesn't destroy what little good remains between us. I don't want it all to end in hate." Laura nodded, feeling the same anguish. "Me neither, Henry. But the truth is I'm terrified of what will happen next. Who will I become? What will I lose? And that's exactly what scares me too," Henry interrupted, voice revealing the desperation he was trying to hide. "If we separate, who will we be? How are we going to deal with the fact that, no matter how hard we try, we will never be able to erase what happened?" Silence fell between them again, but this time it was different. There was a mutual understanding that there was no more room for pretending. They were at a breaking point, where any decision they made could define the rest of their lives. And that terrified them. Still, they both knew that the only way to move forward was to face this dilemma head-on, without any more excuses or delays. And as they sat there, side by side, the reality of their situation finally solidified. They would have to make a choice, and that choice, however painful, would need to be made with clarity, honesty, and, above all, courage. The morning after their final conversation, Henry made a decision. He knew he could no longer delay the inevitable. He took a piece of paper and a pen, sitting at the kitchen table, where he and Laura had so often shared moments of complicity. But this time, words would not be exchanged in dialogue. They would be written, cold and definitive, a letter that would end everything they once represented to each other. Laura woke up hours later, finding the house enveloped in an unusual silence. In the room, the bed next to his was empty, and something in the air suggested that Henry was no longer there. She slowly walked to the kitchen and found the note. With his heart racing, he picked up the paper and began to read. Henry's handwriting, firm and clear, overflowed with the seriousness he always demonstrated in his most important moments. "Laura," the letter began, "this is the most difficult decision I have ever made. I know you are also lost, trying to understand who you are and what you need to move forward. So I'm leaving you the space you need. I'm leaving, but not out of anger or revenge, but because I realize that we are both trapped in a life we can no longer fix. Our story, no matter how beautiful it once was, has come to an end. I hope you find the happiness you are looking for. This is my way of letting you go and finally freeing myself too." When Laura finished reading, she felt a wave of shock run through her body. She knew the marriage was in shambles, but seeing that reality embodied in words was devastating. He sat at the table, the letter in shaking hands, feeling the weight of what it meant to lose Henry forever. Tears began to roll down her face, and she realized that, in trying to find herself again, she ended up losing him forever. Henry was right. The time had come for both of them to go their separate ways. She knew there was no going back, that what they had was irretrievably lost. Hours later, Laura was alone in the apartment, memories of her marriage crumbling around her. She got up, still shaken, and began to gather her things. There was no rush, just the need to confront the emptiness that now inhabited the space around him. When she found a photo of the two of them, taken years earlier during a trip to Paris, she finally broke down. It was impossible not to compare the happiness of those times with the despair I now felt. She knew that, as much as she had tried to find herself outside of marriage, the price was too high. Laura realized that, by trying to be true to herself, she ended up destroying everything that once made her happy. Meanwhile, Henry walked the streets of New York aimlessly, trying to absorb the gravity of what he had done. He knew that leaving Laura was the only way, but that didn't make the decision any less painful. He felt empty, as if a part of him had been ripped away. At one point, he stopped at a cafe he used to frequent before meeting Laura. He ordered a black coffee, sat at a table in the corner and looked out the window, observing the movement of the city that continued to be indifferent to his suffering. As he sipped his coffee, Henry reflected on what came next. He didn't have a plan, he didn't know where he would go or what he would do, but there was something inside him that yearned for a new chance, a fresh start. He knew it would be difficult, that the ghosts of the past would accompany him for a long time, but at the same time, he felt a slight relief at finally having put an end to the story that was consuming them. Time passed and Henry and Laura continued their separate lives. He moved to a new apartment, started going to new places, met new people, but always with the invisible mark of the pain he carried. Laura in turn also tried to rebuild her life. He returned to work with more intensity, but the emptiness persisted. Despite searching for her own identity outside of her marriage, she discovered that the choices she made led her to a lonely and bitter place. Years later, in an unexpected encounter in a bookstore, Henry and Laura crossed paths again. Both were different, more mature, but the scars of their history remained visible in their eyes. They exchanged a look that said everything without words. They knew they could never go back, that what they once had was lost forever. But there was also a silent understanding, an acceptance that they both did the best they could with the circumstances they had. Henry was the first to break the silence. "I hope you're okay, Laura," he said sincerely. Laura smiled, a sad but sincere smile. "I am Henry. And I hope you are too." They both nodded and then went their separate ways once again. There was no heartache, just the melancholy of what could have been. And so their story, marked by love, betrayal and loss, finally came to an end. An end that, although painful, brought the liberation they sought so much.